Now, ships in the 14th century BCE are not sailing very long distances over open water. So shipping at that time was pretty much limited to a few navigable routes, mostly pretty close to the coastline. And this is essentially very beneficial for maritime raiders who are able to use the ruggedness of that coastline and the numerous inlets and islets that are lining the coastline. And they're able to hide from those who are shipping goods from one place to another. This means, of course, that unfortunately for those merchants, it is entirely too late for them to escape by the time they notice that a maritime raider has spotted them. One record we have of this is an inscription from the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III, which essentially just details his establishment of defenses along the Nile Delta against these commerce raiders. And if we go to a mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu, there are accounts, numerous accounts of Egypt's battle with the so-called Sea Peoples. And this is a loose confederation of what we would call pirates that operated between the 13th and 12th centuries BCE. Now, it wouldn't be until the rise of the Roman Empire that we sort of see a successful concerted effort to eradicate piracy. For example, when the pirates sacked the Roman town of Ostia in 67 BCE, a new law was issued which essentially authorized the Roman general Pompey the Great to use whatever means necessary to deal with this so-called scourge. And, you know, it worked. It was pretty effective in that region. But pirates, of course, were not entirely eradicated. And we'll see that pirates sort of pop up from time to time. We even see them today. And so we know their successors have navigated the seas for at least the last 2,000 years. Now, one of the more interesting things to think about is how do we know what we know about pirates? And part of that is because there is a lack of texts from pirates. And part of that is due to the fact of their very nature, which is plausible deniability, very important in their line of work. You don't want to openly admit in writing that you are a pirate because it is illegal. The other issue is that we just have missing records. There's a lot of natural disasters that are occurring throughout the Atlantic world, particularly on the Caribbean islands, where a lot of these pirates would spend their time. And so letters from governors and other officials might not have made it to London, which means that they wouldn't be in the records we have available. Now, we do have a number of pirate trial transcripts, but we have to keep in mind with those that you're dealing with people who have been caught and are being tried for the act of piracy. Most people are going to be intent on saving themselves. And so there's a lot of professions of innocence and, you know, pirates made me do this. I didn't have any choice. So you have to kind of read between the lines with these trial transcripts. And of course, you also have to remember that it's not like trial transcripts today where, you know, you've got somebody who's able to type. This is all handwritten and recorded. And so how much of the material is 100% accurate? Difficult to say. And it's also coming from the government perspective, which is the other set of documents that we tend to have access to, which are official government accounts. These are letters from royal governors or colonial officials, members of the harbor duty, and they are essentially writing to the Board of Trade and Plantations or any other sort of higher official about their experiences with pirates. Now, colonial governors, of course, are going to try to assert that they had nothing to do with piracy, that they were actively trying to rid their region of piracy. But we know that that is not necessarily the case for a lot of them. And so again, it's reading between the lines. And the last sort of major source that we have is a book by a man named Captain Charles Johnson. That is a pseudonym as far as we can tell. Some have said that this was Daniel Defoe. I have not found enough concrete evidence to make that assertion, but we do know that this Charles Johnson was a contemporary because a general history of the pirates was published in 1724. And so it's likely that he heard a lot of the stories from people who had encountered pirates, merchants who had suffered losses from pirates, as well as perhaps meeting certain pirates in a tavern or something similar. But we also know that a large amount of what he writes in this book is essentially made up. Now, the people might be real. We have the ability to corroborate the identities of some of these people, but there's no way for him to have known conversations that were happening on board the ship, or the origins of a lot of these people, because we just don't have that information. So it's an interesting source to peruse if you're interested in piracy. Lots of great storytelling, but it is sort of just that, a story. Now, we know, as I mentioned, that contemporaries were very interested in the lives of pirates. There was such a fascination with these, villains of all nations, as they were often referred to. And we're going to see how not everybody agreed with that particular sentiment. And we can kind of see this because this book by Captain Charles Johnson was a bestseller in his day. And as far as I'm aware, it was published in multiple languages and sold many, many copies, which is rare for that particular time period. I think at that time, the only other bestseller was the Bible, which, makes sense. And we know that official cooperation, we're talking explicit support of piracy, has its foundations early, but we see this play out in the Atlantic quite prominently with the so-called sea dogs, who were technically privateers, and we'll get into the difference between a pirate and a privateer in a minute. But they were supported by Queen Elizabeth I. They were often known as Elizabeth's sea dogs. And of course, it was the Spanish who gave them that moniker, the sea dogs. They didn't necessarily refer to themselves that way. Now, being commissioned by Queen Elizabeth I, this meant that their role was to augment the naval English presence at that time. And they helped to play sort of a major developmental role in the exploration and establishment of the English Atlantic. Now, their number one target at that time was the Spanish. This was because at that point in the 1500s, Spain had gotten a very large head start in the colonization process compared to England. And so the English are desperately trying to catch up, not just in terms of acquiring land and resources, but also financially. And so, the Spanish have a really strong armada, which is their navy, but the English Navy at that time, the Royal Navy, not quite as developed as it will come to be later when it becomes known as the greatest navy in the world. Now, operating as privateers under the authority of the Queen gave them a bit of license to wiggle around the law, if you will. And so anyone with a thirst for pillaging Spanish towns or ships, and who had their own ship at their disposal, this is what makes them privateers, they could then seek that commission from Queen Elizabeth I and get sponsorship from investors, companies, shareholders, with the intent on preying on Spanish shipping. At this point, though, we tend to have this idea of pirates as sort of the lower rungs of society. They are, men hard on their luck, but the privateers, the sea dogs at this time, really are from the higher levels of society. We have Sirs Francis Drake, John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, Walter Raleigh, and numerous other prominent individuals. And so they tended to be either born into or raised as nobility. And what's really interesting is that having this particular kind of background and their connections to the maritime world enabled them to sort of foster an appreciation for the act of plundering on the high seas. And this came to be known as discriminating piracy. And it was the Spanish, of course, who pushed for stronger eradication of piracy at the time, because, of course, the Spanish are the ones suffering the most.